Hello and welcome everybody to Getting APIs to Work. Today we want to talk about API business models, and here with me on this channel is John Musser. Hey John, how are you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being back. You are, I think, very well known as the creator and manager of Programmable Web for a long time, and as I think an important part of that, you had this talk and this categorization of API business models. And I think this is something that's really interesting, and it gets more and more interesting because we see more and more APIs. Can you please talk us just a little bit around how this evolved, how this got started, and where it took you on this voyage?
It was a while ago, right? So I think, Programmable Web started in 2005, right? And during those early years, we saw, to keep the story short, we saw a lot, that rapid growth, the early growth of APIs, the web APIs, right? Google Maps and Twilio and all those early ones in those first like 5 or so years. And so at Programmable Web, we got a lot of questions around technology and the business models and go-to-market and developer experience, all sorts of stuff. And so we saw this rapid growth from a handful of business models to a lot more. And then what I saw was more and more questions were coming to us around the business model piece, right? People are coming in and they're seeing these other companies doing it and they're wanting to know, like, how do I do this, or how do I approach this? So that became, and I did a lot of talks and keynotes, and within there was a germ of an idea around business models. And so then, that evolved into its own talk, and we did consulting around it. And so, that was kind of the genesis of that, because it became such a actively sought after piece of discussion.
And I think that's, even though you did that a long time ago, I think that is still the case. I'm still amazed by how often people are asking about business models and all of this. And by now you would think maybe that's something that everybody knows, but clearly it's not the case. And we're still talking about that. So I think that's really interesting. And the other thing that I saw just 2 or 3 years ago, Programmable Web created an updated version of
Yeah.
your original model. And even though your model, I think, was around for a very long time and was inspirational for a lot of people, for today's purpose, we'll use that updated model because
Yeah.
that's the most recent one that's around.
Yeah, they did a really nice,
Okay.
the Programmable Web team did a really nice job of sort of coming up with, taking what had happened in the subsequent 7, 8 years and coming up with, an evolved model of, what the business model world looks like.
One of the things that I really want to have people take away from today's video is go and read that paper that they put out, because I think it's really interesting. It's a little longer, it's around 60 pages, but it's relatively easy to read. And I think it really is something where it kind of expands your mind in terms of understanding all the different business models that you can have. You probably won't use all of them, but that's fine. But it's good to have an understanding of all the different models that are around.
Yeah, because when you see
And
it laid out, I think that's part of the key, right? Just, I didn't even think
yes,
about it that way, right?
yeah, exactly. Oh, here's another way how we could do it, right? And what we won't do today is to really discuss all of the different facets. So there's a whole bunch of categories, but there are four major ones that I think are important to discuss. And we'll go through these four major ones. And then we also talk about a few examples. And hopefully that's interesting enough for everybody to understand, okay, there are very different ways how APIs can help your business. And maybe I should learn a little bit more about those. So let's jump into those four main categories that there are. So the first one that is around is about partner APIs. And that's something that I'm sure also has been around like for the longest time, even back then when you create your model. So how would you characterize partner APIs?
The sometimes it helps to look at the sort of subcategories within that broad category, right? So
Okay.
some of the examples there are like rev share models. So you're B2B and it's a rev share. So an e-commerce model where you're doing a rev share, right? Or an alliance model where we're going to work together as a partnership alliance. And then there's a consulting model within there. And I think when you look at the rev share, that's interesting because you can do an affiliate one, like with affiliate codes, right? Where you're sort of just for doing, there's a reseller model. and you can build up, and then there's an ecosystem model around that. But any of those are all, the idea is that it's a win-win for the partnership, right? So I think that's kind of the key.
I think that's a good way to put it. It's a win-win model. Somehow the API helps with creating more business, generally speaking, and then there's a partner, and you somehow share that in this partner relationship.
And you see a lot of those, like, for a good way to get your head around is like e-commerce models, right? Like Amazon affiliate links and eBay links and those sorts of things. I mean, they all fall under that bucket. So I think those are ones that many of us are familiar with, even if it's not an API model, but as a web model.
Yeah. No, as a business model, I think it's something that a lot of people are familiar with. Yeah. Okay, so that's the first category. Now let's move on to the second one, which is standardized APIs. I think this is something that probably is kind of the biggest change of the landscape since you created your model, because standardization maybe kicked in a little bit later. But how would you characterize like the second category of standardized APIs?
Well, one is sort of the government-led standardization, where it comes from some, often a regulatory piece, right? I think one of the quintessential examples in the last few years has been the PSD2, in the finance space, right?
Yes.
Financial Services Directive, and so I think, particularly in Europe, where that's become a requirement for in the finance space, in the banking space. So that's one where I think driving a lot. And then the other way to look at it is industry-led, where you have, and sometimes the industry just try to keep ahead of the regulators, but how do you come up with some standard that it fits in, again, in like finance and payments, or telco space, where you have a bunch of players that want to have some commonality across that space.
Yeah, I think that's one of the spaces where you probably will see a lot of developments in the next 5 or 10 years, because I think government regulation is going to cover more and more of those things. And we already see new initiatives coming in the EU, and we also see outside of the EU, a lot of countries are picking up this idea. Okay, now let's move on to category number 3. So we looked at the partner ones, the standardization ones. Category number 3 are the productized APIs. And these may be the ones that kind of get most of the visibility because they directly generate money, right?
Yeah. And yeah, you can look at all the cloud services are one, right? Where the coin operated or pay as you go, right? All the cloud APIs, I think, are under that productized category, right? And maybe the last one I'll sort of call out there is that whole birth of API as product, right? So Twilio and Stripe, and ones where since the early day, what they're selling isn't the website and the web service or something else or some physical product. It's the API is the thing, right? So thinking of API as product is in many ways
I guess Twilio and Stripe probably are by far the most quoted examples.
Yes, exactly.
So everybody mentions those, but it because it's easy to understand. I think it makes a lot of sense. Okay, so now let's move on to the last one, which is marketing, and that maybe is a little bit more indirect. So maybe it's not quite as obvious, so to speak, as productized APIs, but for the marketing ones, what would you say is the most important property of those APIs, and how do those work?
Well, I think, so if you think of marketing, so think of like the social APIs are often that. I mean, like Facebook, the early Facebook APIs and Twitter APIs were in many ways marketing, right? In the sense of they gave the breadth to those, or they didn't charge to access them, right? In the early days, and it was just a way for them to market their services because they became embedded everywhere else, right? So Facebook wanted to become the social operating system for the web, and so they just kind of wanted to be everywhere with login and likes and so on, right? Same with Twitter, you want to embed tweets and be able to sort of post tweets from other services. So that was just a way, again, for them to market their service and become embedded elsewhere, right? So I think those are examples of where those happen.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense the way you're saying it. in my mind, oftentimes marketing really means like what the API does is not really kind of how you make your money, but the API helps you to improve the way how you make money. So in the end, right, it makes sense to make it part of your whole go-to-market strategy.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so now we've walked through the 4 main categories, and I thought it might be interesting to just briefly discuss concrete examples. And we came up with 3 examples to discuss. And let's start with the first one, which is the Walgreens photo sharing API. And the Walgreens photo sharing API is a partner model. So how does the Walgreens API, in your mind, like what's the big benefit, so to speak, that the partners, which are Walgreens and whoever uses that API, what they get out of it?
Yeah, the funny thing was, it's a really good one because it's about it's about photo printing, right? So I want to be able to go to my local pharmacy who have printing services, which I could have walked in the old days to go do it, or I could have gone to their website and done it. But by building it into an API, they could build it into other services. So other people could build it into their, Flickr or whatever other sort of photo sharing, SmugMug, other photo sharing services in the early days, or into mobile apps. When you would say, "Oh, I have these photos in my library, and I want to, as a retail customer, I want to go print them." Oh, it's so much easier if I could just do it from the app that I'm in, right? And so that allows, in this case, Walgreens to go and have that ability to be where the customer is, right? I think a lot of that sort of marketing APIs as well. APIs allow you to be where the customer is, right? You get embedded into other workflows, into other products, into other websites, into other mobile apps because you have an API, and that facilitates that. I think part of what was clever about that one was just also that when you take a step back, if you think of all the APIs they could have opened, I think strategically it was interesting that was the one that they chose to do first, rather than just buying products in the store or other things, because it was monetizable directly, and then B, it also generated foot traffic, right? Because typically you would then go into the store and then you have that downstream sale because I'm here and I got to pick up this other thing. So again, it wasn't just that you were picking up your photos. Meanwhile, they had some carry on downstream revenue from that particular transaction.
That's actually a very good point. I never thought about it that way, but I think that's actually a very good point. Yeah. So on the one hand, right, you generate business that probably wouldn't have been there before, which is the people printing the pictures, but you also generate more business as a side effect of them then going to pick them up. So so that's a good one. So I like that example. Okay, now number two. Number two is something that we picked from your current company, Ford Motor Company. So let's briefly talk about that, which is about access to telemetry, or how would you characterize that API? Okay.
Yeah, so it's somewhere between a partner and a productized API. So we have a company that Ford, where we had acquired a couple of years ago, called Autonomic.ai. It's a great company out of Palo Alto, and they were building, and we were one of the early investors, but they were building in the automotive space. Now every car is connected, right? So you can't buy a new car that's has a modem and sends data up into the cloud. And so the technology they built was to take that data coming off of vehicles, pull it up to the cloud, and then aggregate and then clean up that data and present RESTful API and JSON and pretty formatted data that then developers, both from from Ford internally and other partners, could then access that data across millions of vehicles from those APIs, right? And then there are various business models around how that gets priced and sold and so on. But that's the core value proposition there.
Yeah, and I think typical examples when we discuss the right, like fleet management would be a good example where this kind of API would be very interesting. I've heard a lot of insurances looking into this, right? Saying, well, I give you a better insurance rate if you give me access to your API, to your car's API, because then I know better how you are as a driver. Yeah, I think there's a lot of value in the business that you can build on top of that.
It's because it's like I'm now part of the new Ford Pro group, and so this division, this part of Ford is totally focused on the commercial marketplace fleet owners, and they could be a fleet of 3 vehicles or 30,000. But yeah, that telematics data, that sort of where's my vehicle, how's the health of my vehicle, back and forth. I unlock the doors, what's the status of this, the gas tank and so on, becomes super useful in a commercial setting. So, there's a ton of applications that are, we're just kind of getting started as to what that can mean.
Now that we've talked about the second example, let's jump into the third one. And here we have one from a yet different category, which would be the Twitter Authentication API. So when you look at why Twitter is doing that, so the business, let's say, rationale for Twitter to have an authentication API that other services can embed, how would you say that makes sense for Twitter?
Well, first of all, it grows the business, right? So again, because it's an API, you're where the customer is again, right? You can argue, you can present to the customer it's an easier way to be signed up, and so I don't need to remember as many logins and IDs, and therefore, and I can also streamline the process for the customer. But for them, it's a way to get new signups as well as to just always be where the customer is.
Yeah, so it's probably both. I'm always wondering, I'm sure they will dutifully track wherever you sign in with your account. I'm wondering how much that is actually monetized, but I'm sure that is goes a lot into their whole analysis machines, right? Recommendation algorithm and so forth. So maybe if you would balance those two, right? Like what is more valuable, getting more signups from people because they just want to be able to use login, or getting more analytics from people because now they log into different services with Twitter login? I'm not quite sure how that balance will play out, but it's good on both sides, I guess. So
exactly, and as much as anything, that's become one of the greatest debates around the privacy side, right? Because again,
yes,
right?
Yeah. I mean, these buttons, right? They're everywhere now. Just sign in with this and that, and I'm always like, oh no,
oh, it's easy. Don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. You just sign up with this.
Yeah,
don't worry.
Exactly. Everything's fine over here. Okay, great. So now we've walked through our examples, and I think that gave us a good concrete foundation for all the kind of more abstract categories we discussed before. And again, I just want to reiterate that I think it's really important to understand those examples. So for everybody watching, maybe really check out that report, read through the different categories. They all come with examples. So it's something that really helps you to better understand kind of the whole breadth of the space of API business models. And I know there's one thing, John, that you always like to make very clear when we talk about the API business models. And I think we should probably use that discussion to conclude our little video here.
Yeah, I think those are all the external use cases, right? So I think that this is really, they're what you see in the press, and they're what you read about and you're using if you're going to a third party one. But the reality is that the bulk of APIs that are, I think, used overall are the internal use case, right? So those are all external between different companies and businesses, and then there's this huge piece of sort of the under the tip of the iceberg of all the APIs that in every company are being built and used for so many other purposes. Sometimes they overlap with the public ones, but again, there's just a ton. It's a huge piece of the puzzle.
Yes, and I think this is really important to point out, because I think one of the risks that I've seen is that people just focus on these external business models and then think this is all the value I can get out of APIs. And then I always try to explain to them, no, this is just a little part. And maybe it's like you say, I really like that image, right? Maybe this is just the tip of the iceberg. It may be nice, but actually you can get much more out of APIs if you do it right. So I think it's important to keep that in mind.
Yep.
Okay, John, thanks so much for joining. It was really fun to walk through this model. And I hope that everybody now has a little bit better understanding of what API business models look like. I will also link your classic talk from, I think now it's 10 years ago, about API business models from the description.
There's probably we could do 2 more of these to dive into more of those details, right?
Yes. There's definitely no shortage of APIs out there to walk through and find out interesting ways. Also, how they kind of mix different categories together. Right?
Exactly.
So I think just looking at those and learning from how they can work is really something that is very educational. Thanks everybody for joining in. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing. There's always more API content to come. And until the next time, keep getting APIs to work and have a wonderful day. Bye.
Bye.